Due to an incident, it is necessary to evacuate the area. Please leave
go and get your guys, go and get them.
by the nearest exit.
We need some help, yeah.
I'm going to start this episode by taking a look at the merchandise stall located in the City Room that night. The John Barr video, which I use in the title sequence of this series, has clear footage of this area. John Barr himself told Richard D. Hall in a phone call that he started filming about 4 minutes into the incident, and the merchandise stall can be seen intact. Both Richard and Ian Davis have covered this apparent anomaly in some detail, but the reason I'm interested in the merchandise stall is because it played a significant role in the emergency evacuation of the severely injured from the City Room to the casualty clearing station. Before I start, here is a list of the evidence I examine in this episode. After the last episode, I received a comment saying, quote, "I don't get it, what is the point you are trying to make?" End quote. To which I replied, "My approach is to take you through the evidence for you to consider for yourself rather than defending a preconceived position. I'm also encouraging viewers to start digging into the evidence for themselves. There's a mountain of it, and it is all publicly available. See Part 1 for tips on gaining a foothold. That way you can make up your own mind what the point is." So, there you have it. I'm going to compare some still images from the John Barr footage with a photograph of the merchandise stall that appeared on X in April 2016. Here's the original tweet that says that the City Room's merchandise stand is available. Underneath that, someone said, "Hi, is this merch stand inside Victoria Station and what time does it open on Saturday?" To which they reply, "Official merchandise is usually available inside the venue. Occasionally in the City Room, ask Austrians for directions." So that was April 2016. And this is a high resolution photo of the merchandise stall as it was then. So in this image you can see the crowd control barriers around the front here, and you can see that red trestle tables are being used behind the barriers. There's also flimsier bits of display board with merchandise pinned to it, t-shirts mainly. Over at this end there's a member of staff who's selling the merchandise, and he's behind the barriers. And there's a crowd control barrier right at the edge here that's round the corner. So I'm going to compare the stills from the John Barr video with this image. I should warn you in advance that I haven't redacted out the casualties, and there are casualties to be seen in these images, but I think it's important to look at them, which is why I'm showing you this. If you watch the John Barr video, you'll see that the merchandise stall is only visible for a few seconds and the camera wavers about a lot, but I have managed to get a few clear shots of it. In this one you can see that, as Ian and Richard have said, the merchandise stall is intact. The crowd barriers at the front just the same as in the 2016 image. The 1, 2, 3, 4 boards at the back here, the spotlights at the top, the frame round it, the side panels. This is a close-up cropped image of the same one. I'll just point out as well, this big poster in the background is huge, and it's advertising Disney on Ice, which was on that October. It covers a large area of the wall behind the merchandise stall. I've selected this image to point out that there's a crowd control barrier right at the end here, and I think this is the one at the end here where the member of staff is standing behind, and that one is still intact and standing as well. So that's that end of the merchandise stall. That's a close-up of the same image. And now here's the other end of the stall, which is towards the corner. But just to point out that there's a crowd control barrier here in 2016, and it seems to go around the corner, and that's not visible on the John Barr footage. But I've looked closely at this, and that's really the only bit of it that I can see isn't there. This particular image is of interest for another reason, and it's to do with what's going on in this corner. The other thing I want to point out in this image is what appears to be people on the floor and people helping them. One of the reasons I'm pointing this out is because later on it's relevant, but just looking at this now, it seems to me that either all these people are dressed in black or they've been covered over with t-shirts. Now we know from the testimony that t-shirts were used from the merchandise stall to cover victims who were deceased, but this video was taken very shortly after the incident happened, John Barr saying 4 minutes. So I'm not saying what this is, I don't know what this is, but it is something that's visible in the John Barr video. I'm now going to go through the images from City Room 1 on the CCTV image viewer that's on the Rich Planet TV website. This is camera number 14, unit 3, and this camera gives a view of quite a large area of the floor of the City Room. We're looking towards the doors that lead onto the walkway. Now the merchandise stall is just visible in this corner here. You can see the Disney on Ice poster just above it, and these two circles are actually Mickey Mouse's feet. I'll work that out at some point. So I'll go through these one by one and just watch this corner here. A lot of people milling around in these early photos. The crowd's thinning out here, but there's still quite a few people standing around the area of the merchandise stall. And now the place is mostly empty. And here you can actually see the stall. These are the crowd control barriers, and it goes around the corner here, and you can just see the edge of the actual stall there. There's a member of staff in this photo standing behind the crowd control barrier. We're now at 21:41 and 45 seconds. The staff here obviously haven't had much to do for quite a while, but they're still there. Moving on, the time here is 22:01 and 36 seconds, and there are two people standing in the corner just by the merchandise stall, and they seem to be talking to the staff behind the crowd control barrier. I've had a good look at these two people, and I wonder if this is Kim and Phil Dick, because they said in their evidence that they did talk to the merchandise stall holder, and they are in this area for quite a while. Still there, still there, still there, and gone. So 22:02 and 48 seconds, they are still in this picture. The next image is 22:09 and 20, and they're gone. So I'm going to look up the timings on when they were in that place, just to see if it's likely that it was them. The time now is 22:20 and 3 seconds. It's getting busier again here, 22, 24 and 22 seconds. And now we're up to 22:30 and 23 seconds. And the last image before the incident happened is 22:30 and 59 seconds, so that's literally 1 second before. And now mostly this area is redacted from all the following photos, but I'll run through them anyway because there's one particular photo where it isn't. And this is it. So this is now 23:05 and 57 seconds, and you can see the crowd controlled barriers are still there standing. The two people in the image here, as it says in the text, are Cam Hare and Patrick Ennis, and it says that Cam Hare approaches paramedic Patrick Ennis, and they appear to be leading him and pointing him to an area of the city room that a large number of injured casualties are located, and they are pointing in the area of the corner I showed you in the earlier photo. Most of you probably know who Patrick Ennis is by now. Cam Hare is a name I've just recently come across, and I'll explain who he is later in the video. So that's it for the merchandise stall with the Rich Planet CCTV image viewer. Now I'm going to take you through this very handy video that I found on YouTube. It's a walkthrough of the Manchester Victoria Station, and it shows in really good detail the area of the casualty clearing station and the route that was taken from the city room to the casualty clearing station. Just on the left here is the War Memorial entrance, and you can see that from the big tile map on the wall here. Just to the right is the staircase where the casualties were brought down, and this whole area here is the casualty clearing station. It looks very similar to how it did on the night. A good view of the stairs there. And just here is the entrance to the city room. So there are 2 flights of steps, a walkway across and the entrance to the city room. This shows the walkway a bit clearer. And you can just see here these glass doors into the city room. This area here is very visible on some of the CCTV images of the casualty clearing station. So just stopping it here, this entrance you can see is the War Memorial entrance, and this is the bottom of the stairs where the casualties were brought down. And that's it. I'm now going to show you a photo and a video that I found on Mail Online. This article was published on the 24th of May 2017, and it's worth having a look at for the photos because there's a gallery of 150 of them. The one I've picked out to show you is this one, and as you can see it's the casualties being taken down the stairs to the casualty clearing station. This appears to be a young girl being taken down, and as you can see very clearly, this is a crowd control barrier from the merchandise stall. It still has its advertising board attached to it. On this side it's not as clear, but it could be one of the red trestle tables that Freya Lewis and Emily Morell were taken down on. So that's a photo. In a minute I'm going to show you the video, but before I do, I just want to point out these towers here either side. Now these are the tramline overhead wires, and I worked out where this photo was probably taken from. Whoever took that photo and the video that I'm going to show you in a minute, it seems that they were standing on this tram platform, because there's a view of these towers that are holding the tram wires, and a good clear view of the stairs here and the walkway. This is a 1-minute video of casualties being brought down the stairs from the city room to the casualty clearing station. This one as well I found on the Mail Online website I was showing you earlier. Just to point out that you can see a tram sign here, and these are the wires over the tram lines. So I'll play through this in its entirety once, and then I'll go through it again and make some comments. The first thing to say about this video is that I've worked out that the time it was taken that evening was 11:30, so that's an hour into the incident. I'll tell you how I know that in the next episode. The next thing to say is that what you can hear in the background is a tannoy announcement, but it's not the same as the one that was playing in the city room. This is one that was playing on the station concourse. The third thing to say is that in this very first few seconds of the video you can actually see the doors to the city room here, the glass doors, and a lot of activity, people evacuating the casualties and also going in. So watch out for that. The first casualty to be brought down is a young girl on a makeshift stretcher. It looks like a crowd control barrier, and there are 6 people bringing her down. So as they're bringing down this casualty, you'll see people running up the stairs, and this is people who've already taken a casualty down and are coming back up for another one. And you'll see as the video goes on how many people are actually running the other way up the stairs. There's a stream of people coming up the steps here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 there, and another one there. 9 just come up in that short time. There's another casualty about to be brought down the steps at the top here. Now just watch how these people go about the job of bringing this person down on this makeshift stretcher. To me, it looks very well organised and efficient. Just behind him is someone else who's a lady in a wheelchair, and they're about to bring her down as well. And also just to point out that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, there are 9 people on this stretcher. Six people with this one, and more people yet running up the stairs to the city room. And that's it. After finding that video of the people being stretchered out of the city room, I decided to take a look at what was said at the time about the evacuation of those terribly injured people from the city room to the casualty clearing station. From what I remembered of the news reports at the time, there were a lot of stories of heroes, people who were caught up on the night or just happened to be in the vicinity on the night, who were credited with helping the people down on makeshift stretchers. So I found these 3 particular stories that I thought I'd share with you. So the first one is about a man called Paul Reed, and this is actually from Australia, and that reminded me just how big this news was and how it went around the world and was picked up by news agencies all over the world. Even President Xi of China sent condolences, and then of course there was President Trump giving his evil losers speech, and the rest of the leaders around the world also gave their condolences, including President Putin. So back to Paul Reed, and this particular story is about how he comforted the youngest victim of the Manchester attack, who was Safi Roussos. And the quote I've picked out from the article is that he's saying, "A smartly dressed woman appeared and said she was a nurse who had been at the concert. She began to assess her. 2 or 3 police then arrived, and I said we had to get her out of there." Reed and the officers then rigged up a makeshift stretcher from an advertising board and carefully placed Safi on it. The next one I've picked out is this one, and it's about Andy Lowe, who was the station manager at Victoria Manchester railway station that night. And the headline is from the Manchester Evening News, and it says, "Brave rail workers describe how they ran towards danger on the night of the Manchester attack." And the sub-headline is, "Train drivers, conductors and station managers worked through the night helping emergency services." The quote I've picked out for this one is that Andy Lowe is quoted as saying, "We spent an hour and a half making stretchers out of metal barriers. There was a merchandise stall inside. We completely tore it up using the barriers for stretchers and t-shirts as bandages. The ambulance service then set up a triage on the concourse." And finally we have Phil Dick, who was there that night with his wife Kim. Most of the press coverage was actually about Kim Dick and how she encountered Freya Lewis and helped her and the heroics around that. But this particular story from the Telegraph and Argus is about Phil and his role that night, which says, "The 54-year-old, who believes he also saw the remains of the suicide bomber, had to check the bodies of the injured, dead and dying to see if it was his girls. A short time later, with his wife and others, he turned a trestle table into a makeshift stretcher to get a badly injured girl out of the arena. We were waiting with others in the foyer for 10:25 p.m. and having a bit of banter with the merchandise sellers about how you could possibly sell a sweatshirt for £65, when there was a real bright flash, a real loud bang, and then it was just carnage, just chaos." As an aside, I'll just say that the people that I observed before on the CCTV, I am now fairly certain that that was indeed Kim and Phil Dick standing at the merchandise stall, and they do indeed look like they're talking to the staff behind the barrier and perhaps having a bit of banter, as Phil Dick says here. I'm going to come back to this because there's quite a lot to say about it, but I just thought that was an interesting snippet from this particular news report. The stories in the press that went around the world told of ordinary heroes who were doing the best under very difficult circumstances with little help from the emergency services. And I wanted to compare that with the 1-minute video that was captured of the casualties being brought down from the city room to the casualty clearing station. Here it is again. I went through and I actually counted all the people coming up the stairs and all the people coming down, and the totals were 26 for going up the stairs and 21 for coming down. As you can see, a lot of these people are police officers, the vast majority are police officers. There are one or two others, showsex stewards and members of the public, and I think perhaps arena staff, but most of them are actually police officers. And in this 1-minute video, 3 casualties are brought down very efficiently and calmly and very skillfully. And remember, there are 2 very tricky flights of steps here, so that's what's shown in the video. Another piece of evidence I found relating to this is this photo from the CCTV footage that was recorded at 23, 32 and 3 seconds. So that is just after the time that that video was taken. As you can see, the people here are bringing up a crowd control barrier, and it was one that was part of the merchandise stall in the city room. So it looks like they've taken a casualty down and then dropped them off at the casualty clearing station and brought the barrier back up to use for another patient. At the inquiry, there was an expert witness called Professor Anthony Bull from the Centre for Blast Injury Studies, and he was the lead of the blast wave panel of experts who was provided to the inquiry, and he went into some detail about the types of injuries that these victims would have had. So there were 38 people who were left in the room who needed help to get out of there and down those stairs to the casualty clearing station, and they were the most severely injured that night. So Professor Anthony Bull explained what that meant in terms of the injuries that they would have sustained, and he talks about the blast wave and the fact that it has two components, a shock wave, and behind the shock wave is the blast wind, and it's the blast wind that carries the material such as the nuts and bolts that hit people that night. The evidence he gave is really very graphic and gory, but he explained that victims would have suffered primary blast injuries, and they're as a result of the shock wave with the body, and also secondary blast injuries which were caused by moving objects in the blast wind. So this is the shrapnel injuries that I think it's fair to say most of the wounded had these wounds. He gave a graphic description of what that would mean for someone who is hit by one of these nuts or bolts. And he says, quote, "Being struck by a fragment from a blast has been likened to being shot with a bullet. However, the fragment typically causes more devastation as the energy around the object does not travel in a straight line, rather it is tumbling. This means a small wound from a secondary blast injury can cause devastating internal injuries." And alongside both of those, there's another one that caught my eye, which is the quaternary blast injuries, because it mentions that this includes burns. Now I know that some of the victims reported having severe burns that needed hospital treatment, and among them were Ruth Morell and Freya Lewis. From what I understand, these burns aren't caused by fire or flame as such, but rather the shockwave, the actual blast, which causes the burns on the bodies. And so Professor Anthony Bull said that the victims that night sustained all these injuries, and the reason I'm pointing this out is it's important to bear that in mind when we're looking at the evidence of how these victims were transported out of the city room, who transported them out, and what the treatment was later. I'm now going to look at how that evacuation from the city room of those very severely injured people came about. It's a story of upstairs, downstairs, and it involves these four people. Before I get onto them, there's a couple of things I need to point out. The first people on the scene were actually armed police, and they entered the city room and took control of the area and the surrounding area in the arena. Two of these armed police were then stationed at the bottom of the stairs that led up to the city room from the Victoria Station concourse. The second thing to say is that of the emergency services, the ones who are best equipped and best trained to deal with an evacuation of this nature was the Fire and Rescue Service. Now, as we know, they were not on the scene until much later due to a series of command and control errors. But the interesting thing to me about this is that at the inquiry it became very clear that none of the other emergency services stopped to wonder where the Fire and Rescue Service were when the patients were being evacuated from the city room to the casualty clearing station. In Volume 2, Part 2 of the Manchester Arena Inquiry Report, the chairman, who is the Honourable Sir John Saunders, made this comment, quote, "The fact that most of the members of the other emergency services did not notice that Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service officers were not there helping in the rescue suggests a lack of appreciation of the part that fire and rescue services can and do play. If the Joint Emergency Services Interoperability Principles, JESIP, had been fully embedded in the muscle memory of responders, that would not have happened." End quote. And that is a good example of the very mild-mannered criticism that John Saunders made in his reports. Going back to the emergency service personnel who were there on the night, these four turned up very quickly on the scene. The first two to arrive were Mike Smith and Paddy Ennis. They were both on duty that night. Mike Smith for the police, he's a police inspector, and he took on the role of operational commander, and Paddy Ennis of the North West Ambulance Service, or NWAS, who was on duty in Manchester that night, and he's an advanced paramedic. They both made their way up the stairs to the city room. Later on, Dan Smith and Michael Daly arrived. Now, these two never went up to the city room, they stayed downstairs on the station concourse. Dan Smith is also a paramedic for the North West Ambulance Service, but he's got special training with HART, which is a hazardous area response team, and he's the one who took on the role of operational commander for the ambulance service that night. Michael Daly is a doctor, also working for the North West Ambulance Service. He was the first MERIT doctor on the scene. MERIT stands for Medical Emergency Response Incident Team, and he told the inquiry that the primary aim of a MERIT doctor is to give medical support and advice at major incidents, and it's primarily a hands-off role. In fact, all four of these people did say that they were hands-off in terms of treating casualties. Now I'm going to take you through the timeline of how things happened from 22:31, which is when the incident happened in the city room, for the first hour or so with these four people: Mike Smith, Paddy Ennis, Dan Smith and Michael Daly. The first on the scene was Paddy Ennis, and he arrived at 22:42. At the inquiry, he explained that this was the time he recorded in his personal log, and that's how it's known. And what he said was that he was in the office doing admin work when the calls came in about this incident at the arena. He was watching the emergency calls coming in, and he took an ambulance car to the scene and he parked at Hunt's Bank. He got out of the car, and what he said was that there were a lot of police already on the scene, and as soon as he got out of the car he encountered casualties. At 22:46 he radioed through to the ambulance control room, and this recording was actually played at the inquiry. During that contact with the control room, Paddy Ennis actually says, quote, "We have nail bomb, possibly with shooting," and he was asked about this at the inquiry. And this is what he told the inquiry about that situation he was in at that time, which was 22:46. And what he said was, "The first two patients I'd spoken to had said they thought they had been shot, and their injuries appeared potentially to be consistent with that, albeit also consistent with a nail bomb or explosion." This little snippet from the inquiry caught my attention, and the reason is that very early on there were reports of an active shooter, and that caused all sorts of repercussions down the line. I'm going to come back to this to look at it in more detail, but I just thought I'd put that in. While Paddy Ennis is round at the Hunts Bank entrance, Mike Smith arrives at the War Memorial entrance. So here he is arriving at 22:45 and 15 seconds. As he walks through the Victoria Station entrance at the War Memorial, he radios through to the control room and he gets to the station concourse. As you can see in this picture, it's pretty empty by now, and there are the two firearms officers at the bottom of the stairs. There's also a sergeant there from the Greater Manchester Police called James McGowan, and Mike Smith and P.S. McGowan talk to the firearms officers at the bottom of the stairs. These two then run up the stairs to the city room, and on the walkway that leads into the city room they encounter another police officer who's from the British Transport Police. He's called Matthew Martin. James McGowan and Matthew Martin then walk towards the city room, and a little while later Michael Smith follows them. And Mike Smith gets into the city room at 22:48 and 6 seconds. Here he's shown talking to James McGowan and two other firearms officers. Going back to the timeline, I'll pick up Paddy Ennis at this point. He walks round from Hunts Bank to the War Memorial entrance, and he gets there at 22:49 and 43 seconds. This is all captured on CCTV, which I'll show you in a minute. He talks with police at the entrance, and then he makes his way up the stairs, and he's actually escorted by the same BTP officer Matthew Martin that Mike Smith encountered earlier. This is Paddy Ennis arriving at the War Memorial entrance. He talks to a police officer on the door. He's let in and he walks through the War Memorial entrance towards the station concourse. On the way he stops to talk to some GMP officers, and amongst them is Matthew Martin, the BTP officer. And this image shows Paddy Ennis and Matthew Martin going up the stairs together. There's something else interesting going on in this picture, and that's this group of officers here. These are called the Tactical Aid Unit. They're from Greater Manchester Police as well, but they're a special unit who arrived on the scene around this time, and the time here is 22:51 and 28 seconds. You can tell who they are by the red dots on the shoulders, and the lead for the TAU is Cam Hare, who I mentioned earlier. Back to the timeline, and Mike Smith, who's in the city room, runs out to meet Paddy Ennis as he's on the footbridge, and they walk together to the city room, and they're captured on CCTV both entering the city room at 22:53 and 1 second. And then this is the view from the city room, and it's Mike Smith running towards the doors. GMP Inspector Michael Smith runs out of the city room onto the footbridge. Just outside the doors on the footbridge at this point is paramedic Patrick Ennis. And there he is. And there they are. So they're both there in the city room at 22:53 and 1 second. At 22:53 and 1 second, both Mike Smith and Paddy Ennis are in the city room. At 3 seconds to 11 o'clock, Dan Smith and Michael Daly enter the Victoria Station concourse. Here are Michael Daly and Dan Smith arriving at the War Memorial entrance. And they go into the Victoria Station at 3 seconds to 11 o'clock. As I take you through the next bit of this timeline, just bear in mind that the first casualty arrives at the casualty clearing station at 23:07. So everything that happens between Dan Smith and Michael Daly arriving at the concourse and the first casualty arriving downstairs from the city room happens within this 7 minutes. Around the same time that Dan Smith and Michael Daly are arriving at the Victoria Station, Paddy Ennis exits the city room. Then at 8 seconds past 11, Dan Smith and Michael Daly are caught on CCTV talking to the firearms officers at the bottom of the staircase. This interaction between the firearms officer and the medic, Michael Daly, and the paramedic, Daniel Smith, caused a bit of a stir at the inquiry, and the reason for this was that Michael Daly had said in his evidence that he was absolutely certain that the firearms officer at the bottom of the stairs had prevented them from entering the city room.
So before I turn to Ms. Roberts, an issue has arisen in relation to the evidence that Dr. Daly has given about speaking to a firearms officer at the foot of the stairs. We are, as ever, greatly assisted by the Operation Mantline team, and Mr. Horwell has been in contact with us on their behalf. We hope we may be able to get a relevant still, but it is derived from the station footage, not the footage operated by the arena, and that is just proving a little complicated. Can I invite you to just rise for 5 minutes or so while we see if we can sort that out? I think, in fairness to Ms. Roberts, that we should resolve that before she asks her questions. Okay? Thank you.
And when they came back, this is what they discussed.
Mr. Lopez, this document will be given an INQ reference in due course, but can you please display the second page? We'll just set this in the context, Dr. Daly, to see. The first still we've already seen. This is at 22:59:57 and is of you and Dan Smith entering the War Memorial entrance. Is that correct?
Yes.
Over the page we'll have our first new still. Captured seconds later is a view from the area of the pub on the station concourse of the two of you walking in the direction of the staircase. Is that correct?
Yes.
And at the bottom we can see, circled in red, a firearms officer who is furthest from the camera wearing what appears to be a ballistic helmet with his arm raised pointing in the direction of the staircase and city room. Is that right?
Yes.
And Mr. Smith, I think, is on the left of the red circle with that kit bag. And that is timed at 23:00:07. And could we go to the next still, please? Which top one is 6 seconds later, not as zoomed in, and then at 23:00:12 we can see that huddle of people is still where they were. And then over the page, please, we can see a cropped in image of the bottom image on the previous page, timed at 23:00:12. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Lopez. And we know from the sequence of events that after that shot is taken, you move back towards the War Memorial entrance, where we see you in that huddle with those 3 paramedics who are briefly there, and that is followed by speaking to Mr. Ennis. Does that all fit together in the timeline of what we've looked at? So, Dr. Daly, you hadn't seen those stills before today, is that right?
I hadn't.
I just want to give you an opportunity to tell us what you believe was occurring in the stills that we can see.
So this is where myself and Dan Smith had just met up outside and then proceeded inside the station. As I said earlier, we started walking towards the steps because we knew that the city room was where the incident had happened.
So how had you got that information?
I think someone outside had told us.
The city room?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, certainly not on the station concourse.
Okay, but you knew to get to it you would need to go up the stairs?
Over the bridge, yes.
Okay.
So we proceeded towards the bridge, and that's where we encountered the police and were told we couldn't proceed.
So your recollection is that in the conversation that we can see, which takes place a couple of seconds after 11 o'clock exactly, you were told by a GMP firearms officer you could not go up the stairs.
That's right.
Well, I don't propose to ask you any further questions about that, or indeed anything else, Dr. Daly. Can I just check with Mr. Jameson, firstly, whether he has anything arising?
No, thank you all with your comment, but can I also offer my thanks to the Operation Man's Line team and say also if there exists any audio recording of that conversation, it would obviously be very...
Yeah, I mean, we will obviously make further inquiries
Yes.
surrounding it, but it was absolutely right.
Oh, absolutely,
While
I entirely
the
agree.
doctor, if Dr. Hill is here,
I
that
entirely
he
agree.
gets the opportunity to see it and comment on it.
Yes.
And I understand one of those inquiries is seeking to identify the firearms officer in question. Thank you, Mr. Jameson.
Thank you.
Ms. Roberts, do you have any questions?
As a result of the evidence given by Michael Daly, they did indeed identify the 2 armed police who were stationed at the bottom of the stairs, and they were PC Tilsley and PC Dalton. And on the 20th of July 2021, PC Tilsley was called to give evidence to the inquiry. As part of this evidence, the inquiry ran through a set of stills from the CCTV, and the point of this was to show that before Michael Daly had arrived at the station, the armed police stationed at the bottom of the stairs had allowed several people up those stairs to the city room. So I'll just run through these now and point a few things out. Most of the people who were allowed up were police, but the point was that they were unarmed police. I'll stop here because this slide is very interesting, and it's 22:54 and 30 seconds. The police shown at the bottom of the stairs here are the Tactical Aid Unit, led by Sergeant Cam Hare. And there's a quote here from the audio which says that Cam Hare is talking to his team and he's saying, "Right, gents, as we go up and liaise with the inspector up at the scene now. We're going up, the inspector's going to direct us when we get up there, mate." And the inspector he's referring to is Mike Smith, who is indeed upstairs in the city room. The point of this next set of images is that even a member of the public was allowed up the stairs, and it's shown here by the redacted image with the blue square around it. More unarmed police, and that's it. At the end of Troy Tilsley's evidence, there weren't any questions from the barristers apart from this one, and it's Richard Horwell KC, and he is the barrister representing Greater Manchester Police, and this is how the exchange went.
Finally, Mr. Horwell, only other potential questioner.
A minute or two.
Fine. Thank you.
I'm not going to go through the very lengthy sequence of events with you, but looking at them in terms of those who are not police officers, whilst you were at the foot of the stairs or close to the stairs, we know that Mr. Ennis went up and walked past you. There's one photograph. I'm not going to ask for it to be put up. It's at page 39. But whilst you were at the foot of the stairs, a member of the public you permit to go up the stairs, having had a discussion with him. And then the incident with Dan Smith and Dr. Daly. And after that, Mr. Ennis comes back down the stairs, he goes back up the stairs. The unknown female comes down the stairs, helping a casualty together with a police officer. And then after a very short time, she goes back up the stairs. And you weren't interested in stopping any of those because they were there to help casualties either on the bridge or in the city room.
Yes, that's correct.
And would you have prevented anyone, let alone a doctor, from going into the city room to treat those who you had only seen a few minutes before so severely injured?
Can't think of any reason why I would.
No, thank you.
Mr. Hallwell, the whole purpose of this, and indeed the next witness, is to see whether Dr. Daly's account of being stopped was in fact accurate. Unless someone's going to disabuse me, the only issue is whether he has an accurate memory of what happened. It's not in any way suggested that he wasn't doing his best to help the inquiry.
And I am certainly not suggesting otherwise. So
no, I didn't think you would, and obviously I would listen to that, but I thought it may be best to clear that up.
No, and thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Going back to the timeline, as Dan Smith and Michael Daly enter the Victoria Station concourse, Paddy Ennis starts making his way down from the city room back to the concourse. And during this time, this is when Michael Daly and Dan Smith have the conversation with the firearms officers. A minute or so later, Paddy Ennis is captured on CCTV talking with Dan Smith and Michael Daly, and it's most likely about setting up the casualty clearing station. Just a few minutes later, Paddy Ennis is back in the city room, and Dan Smith and Michael Daly are discussing setting up the casualty clearing station. And then, as you can see from this timeline, just a minute and a half later, the very first casualty arrives at the casualty clearing station. Going through the CCTV images, this is Paddy Ennis talking to Dan Smith and Michael Daly at 23:01 and 24 seconds. There's a little bit of toing and froing, and then Dan Smith and Michael Daly are discussing setting up the casualty clearing station at 23:05 and 27 seconds. Dan Smith then goes outside and is directing people towards the War Memorial entrance. He checks on a casualty, and at 23:07 and 3 seconds, both Michael Daly and Dan Smith are back in the War Memorial entrance. And here's an image from 23:10 and 9 seconds, and as you can see, there are already 4 casualties here that have been brought down from the city room. Dan Smith gave evidence to the inquiry, and he was asked about setting up the casualty clearing station. And one thing that puzzled me was why they would put casualties on the floor directly near the entrance on the matting, which looks dirty to me, and where people are walking in and out. My assumption was that it's because that's where the ambulances were queuing up and that they could get these casualties out quickly to the ambulances. But Dan Smith actually said the reason they chose this area was because it looked to him like a casualty clearing station should look, and he would be directing the priority 1 casualties to one side of this entrance and the priority 2 to the other side, and that was the reason they started here. When you think about it, they only had 7 minutes from arrival to this moment when the first one arrived, and so they had to do some very quick thinking about this. And the other thing that occurred to me was that Dan Smith said that when the casualties were being brought down, he didn't even notice that they weren't on stretchers, that they were being brought down on railings and tables. And again, when you think about it, these casualties were being brought down at one hell of a lick, so it's perhaps not surprising that he didn't even notice how they were being brought down and who was bringing them down. From then on, Mike Smith and Paddy Ennis are up in the city room and they're captured several times on CCTV, talking with each other. Meanwhile, Dan Smith and Michael Daly are downstairs and they're dealing with all these casualties that are being brought down very quickly. 38 casualties arrive at the casualty clearing station between 23:07 and 23:42. And they have to find places for all of them. The question I was asking myself at the end of all this was, out of these 4, who was in control of the operation? From the evidence presented at the inquiry, I think it's fair to conclude that it was Inspector Mike Smith, as operational commander for the police, who directed the evacuation of the severely injured out of the city room to the casualty clearing station on makeshift stretchers, including those made from the merchandise stall. I'll just go through once again the sequence of events. Mike Smith got to the city room at 22:48 and 6 seconds. Paddy Ennis joined Mike Smith at 22:53 and 1 second. Then 8 minutes later, Paddy Ennis left the city room to make his way down to the station concourse. There he met up with Dan Smith, who by this time had taken on the role of operational commander. At the inquiry, it became clear that by the time Paddy Ennis and Dan Smith had this conversation, the evacuation of the severely injured from the city room had already begun. The inquiry chairman, John Saunders, asked Paddy Ennis when he was giving evidence about this. He said, quote, "I do see from the log that actually people are already being moved, so the decision about moving people out of the city room had already been made before you spoke to Dan Smith." Paddy Ennis replies, "Yes. The direction of movement of patients towards Victoria Station Concourse was something that had already started." John Saunders goes on to question Paddy Ennis about the use of stretchers, because he was aware that there weren't any stretchers on site at that time, and Paddy Ennis tells the inquiry that it was the decision of the police officers to use makeshift stretchers. So what he's saying is that they decided to move the patients on makeshift stretchers before he'd even spoken to Dan Smith. And by rights, Dan Smith, as the operational commander for NWAS, should have been involved in this discussion and this decision. And then John Saunders asked Paddy Ennis a further question, quote, So you'd gone along with that idea of using makeshift stretchers? And Paddy Ennis replied yes. And then he adds, it wasn't my idea.
You provide an update over the talk group, is that right?
Yes.
And you provide information about how many people you think have died, which at that time you believe is around 15.
Yes.
Okay, but you are saying the injured are gradually being moved out now. Does that include people on improvised stretchers? I mean, we know people are being helped out, the walking wounded.
Yes, I mean, I don't know at what point
Okay.
the improvised stretchers came into it, so, but certainly, did say to people, I don't know whether it's captured in this, use whatever you can. Use
So you were
barriers.
given the instruction to do that?
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
When Inspector Mike Smith gave evidence to the inquiry, a few things came to light. The first was that he had no training in dealing with casualties beyond basic first aid. So when he was asked about this, he replied, I think the first aid training that we had up to that point was really basic first aid. It was nothing like trauma training. So he didn't have training in dealing with severely injured casualties. And these casualties were the most severely injured of all because they were priority 1 and priority 2, which meant that they had life-threatening injuries such as catastrophic bleeding, broken bones, severe burns, and severe internal injuries. The other thing that came to light at the inquiry was that although the Fire and Rescue Service hadn't shown up at this point, and the paramedics were only just arriving and everything on the ground, the emergency service that really did have large numbers on the ground was the police. And Inspector Mike Smith was not only the operational commander on that night for GMP, but also for the British Transport Police. And when he was asked about the Tactical Aid Unit, he said he gave instructions to their sergeant, who was Cam Hare. And it became clear that Mike Smith knew Cam Hare because he'd spent 5 years in that unit as a sergeant. And that reminded me of the photo of the police bringing up the barrier from the merchandise stall back up to the city room. The two men leading the way are from the TAU. They have red spots on their shoulders. And the other thing that came to light, which I've picked up from the inquiry, was that Mike Smith had 30 unarmed police in the city room under his command. But that was only in the city room, and judging by the media footage, there were far more cops on the scene, in and around Victoria Station, all under Mike Smith's command. One of the puzzling things to me about the inquiry was why no questions were asked about how the casualties were transferred from the floor onto the makeshift stretchers. It appears from the Daily Mail footage that those carrying the injured down the stairs were well drilled in this part of the operation, but a cursory look at a few first aid training videos shows that the process of moving a severely injured casualty from the floor to a stretcher is a tricky procedure, even for trained staff with specialist equipment who have experience of dealing with such casualties. How a group of people with no such training, experience or equipment were able to safely transfer 26 severely injured casualties from the floor onto improvised stretchers is yet another unusual aspect of the Manchester Arena incident, which the inquiry chose not to explore. Next time, I'll be taking a closer look at the injuries sustained by the casualties of the Manchester Arena incident.
Down poison